So we've told three stories today, and our sermon today is going to be a storying approach. This is a method that a lot of missionaries use throughout the world. I actually find it very useful in today's world. If you've taken pretty much any of the afternoon classes that I've taught, we've had some conversation about literate learners versus orality and how the younger generations, even in a literate country like the United States, are pressing towards orality, whether that's pictures or video or audio. This is just kind of the shape. So I'm going to be telling two more stories today, the story of Joseph and then the story of Priscilla, Aquila, Paul, and Apollos. Now I want you to pay attention because at the end of these stories, this is going to be interactive. And so I hope that at the end of the story, you will be able to see the connection between all five of the stories that are being told today, because there is a connection, and I think we can have some really interesting conversation around that. So let's start with the story of Joseph. Joseph was the second youngest of 12 sons. He was his father's favorite son, and his father Jacob showed him that he was his favorite by giving him a really fancy coat with lots of different colors. God also gave Joseph many dreams, and in these dreams, Joseph understood them, and his brothers understood them to be that Joseph was going to be a leader in some capacity over them. And so because of these two things, Joseph's brothers were very angry with him, and they were very jealous of him. So when he was 17 years old, his brothers, I have it here on the map, his brothers went up from where they were staying. They went up to Shechem, and so Jacob sent Joseph after them to go check on them and to see how they're doing. And by the time he got to Shechem, they had already moved on. He asked someone, and that man said, "Oh, they've gone to Dothan." So he goes to Dothan, which is even further north, so that's the northernmost point. And they saw him coming a long way off, and they had a conspiracy of how to get rid of Joseph. And so there was a band of Midianites. You can see that blue arrow there heading to the north, so they would have come up from northwestern Saudi Arabia. There were a band of Midianites who came by, and they sold Joseph to these Midianites. And they took his coat, and they tore it, and they dipped it in goat's blood. And so they went home to their father, and they told their father that Jacob had been killed by some kind of wild animal. And they showed him the coat, and Jacob was completely distraught. He could not be comforted. And so, meanwhile, Joseph has been sold off in Egypt. The Midianites came back down the coast, and they went to Egypt. So you see the blue and the red all going together. Not all partnerships are free will partnerships, and this is one that was not. And so these band of traders take him into Egypt, and they sell him to a man named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was a very powerful man in Egypt. He was the captain of the king's guard. He was one of Pharaoh's officers, and so he was sold into his house. And God was faithful to Joseph. God blessed everything that he did. God blessed him and made him successful in what he did. And so Potiphar realized that God's hand was on Joseph and that everything he did was successful. So he did the smartest thing he could, and he appointed him as the manager inside his house. So Joseph had control over everything inside of the house, so that the only thing that Potiphar had to think about was, number one, let Joseph do his job, and number two, just put food in his mouth. These were his only concerns. Now, Joseph was a handsome young man. He was good looking, and Potiphar's wife had an eye for him. And every day she would call out to him to come to their bedroom and to lie with her. And he would refuse. He said, "Look, no one in this house is greater than I am. In fact, the only thing that Potiphar has held back from me is you. How can I sin against God in this way?" But she kept pressing and she kept pressing. Then one day, all the men of the house were gone. And she saw Joseph there, and she grabbed him by the coat, and she pressed him one more time, and he fled away. But she had such a firm hand on his coat that he fled away without his coat. And so now she spun a tale to all the men of her house and to Potiphar and said, "Joseph came in here to take advantage of me, and look, I have his coat." Potiphar was angry, and he threw Joseph in prison. And not just in any prison. Remember, he's the captain of the guard. So he threw Joseph in the prison where all of Pharaoh's prisoners were kept. And so, but God was still with Joseph, even in prison. God showed him his steadfast love. And everything that Joseph did in prison was successful. In fact, God gave Joseph favor with the warden, so that the warden put Joseph over everything inside the prison, so that the only thing the warden had to think about was, let Joseph do his job. After a while, there were two prisoners that were thrown into jail from Potiphar's dreams. One was a baker, and the other was a cupbearer. And they both had these really disturbing dreams. And one day, when Joseph was making his rounds, he saw that they were disturbed. And he said, "What's the matter?" And they told him about their dream. And Joseph said, "Look, the interpretation of dreams belongs to God. Tell me your dream." And so they told him their dream. And Joseph gave them an accurate interpretation of these dreams. And just like Joseph had predicted, both of them were released from prison. But the moment that they were released from prison, they forgot about Joseph. They completely forgot what he had just done for them. And so 2 years went by, and one night, Pharaoh had a troubling dream. And he was so troubled that he called all of his wise men, all of his sorcerers, all of his fortune tellers to tell them the meaning of the dream, but no one could tell them the meaning of the dream. And at this moment, the cupbearer said, I remember there was this man in prison who correctly interpreted my dream and the baker's dream. And so Pharaoh said, "Bring him to me." So they brought Joseph into Pharaoh's palace. And Joseph said, "Meaning the dreams belongs to the Lord. Tell me your dream, and God will tell us what it means." And so Pharaoh told him about two dreams. The first dream was one with 7 skinny cows and 7 fat cows. And the second dream was one with 7 good ears of corn and 7 bad ears of corn. And so Joseph told them the meaning of the dream, that there would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And so what Pharaoh needed to do was appoint a person with a lot of wisdom and administrative skill who would be able to manage the good years so that in the bad years they would have plenty to eat. And Pharaoh said, "I know just the guy, and it's you." And so he appointed Joseph to be his second in command. He took his ring off his finger, his signet ring, and he put it on Joseph's hand. And he gave him some royal clothes to wear. And whenever they would go out in public, Joseph would ride in the second royal chariot right behind Pharaoh, so that in everything in Egypt, Joseph was number 2. Just as Joseph had predicted, the famine came. After 7 good years, the famine came. And the famine was so great that people from all over that area flocked to Egypt. And one of these groups that migrated to Egypt for food was Joseph's brothers. Now remember, he's dressed like an Egyptian, so when they came into the palace to try to buy food, they didn't recognize him, but he saw them. He knew who they were. And so he devised an elaborate plot to try to see if they had changed at all, if they had become honest men or not, or if they would sell out their youngest brother in the same way that they sold him out. And as the plot unfolded, he saw that they were willing to take the blame for what they had done to Joseph. And so at this point, he revealed to them, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Now they were terrified because of this news. In fact, they were so scared that none of them could give an answer at all. And he says, "Look, it's okay. Yes, you sold me as a slave, but it wasn't you that sent me here. It was God that sent me here. And God sent me here to preserve a remnant on the earth and to save many, many survivors from this famine. What you intended for harm, God intended for good. God sent me here." This is the first story. This is the story of Joseph. The second story is the story of Priscilla and Aquila, Paul and Apollos. And this one starts in Corinth. I have another map for this because this one is even more convoluted. Priscilla and Aquila were from the area of Pontus. So if you see that yellow line, it starts over there in northeastern Turkey. That is Pontus. So they were from Pontus, but at some point they had gone to Rome, and because of some racial discrimination against the Jews by the emperor in Rome, they were leaving Rome, and they had just headed to Corinth. So Paul was on one of his missionary journeys when he met up with them in Corinth. And he liked to be with them because they all had the same profession. And so they moved from Corinth, where they had been there for a while, and they moved to Ephesus. And so in Ephesus, they would work in the day. They were all tent makers. And then at night, on the weekends, Paul would go out into the place of worship, and he would reason with the Jews, and he would reason with the Greeks. And at first, not many people believed. In fact, he was so unsuccessful that he decided he wasn't going to work in the house of worship anymore. What he was going to do is he went next door to someone's house named Justus, and he started meeting in Justus's house. And about this time, people started believing. And God gave Paul a dream, and in the dream he said, "Paul, don't be afraid. Don't close your mouth. Keep on speaking, because there are many people in this city that I am going to save." And so he wanted Paul to continue his work. And so Paul continued his work, and the mounting pressure grew to the point where the Jews united an attack against him and all of the believers, and they took them to court. And they couldn't get the answer they wanted from the court, and so they took the leader of the house of worship, and they drug him out publicly, and they beat him in front of everybody just to set the tone right and just to set things straight, to get a little bit of satisfaction. And so after this, Paul stayed there for about a year and a half, and he continued to work. And then he went on through the area of Galatia. And in Galatia, he went back to go revisit the churches that he'd gone to. And so he left Priscilla and Aquila right there in Ephesus. And so now you see that line that's coming from northern Egypt up to Ephesus, where you see all three of those stars grouped together. And so Apollos was a Jew, and he was very eloquent. He was able to reason with the scriptures, but he only knew the Old Testament. And some of the New Testament stories up until the baptism where Jesus was baptized by John. Priscilla and Aquila, they heard him there in Ephesus. They saw his potential, so they took him under their wing so that they could teach him the rest of the story, so they could tell him how the story of Jesus ended. And so after he was better trained, he decided that he wanted to go back to Corinth, or go on to Corinth. And so all of the believers there in Ephesus, they encouraged him, and they wrote letters for him so that when he would go to Corinth, he would be well received. And he did go to Corinth, and he was well received because of the letters. And so their connections back to Corinth helped Apollos go there, and he had a very productive ministry doing what he was already good at doing, which was reasoning with Jews and Greeks from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. And so now I have this question for you. Do you see the central theme of these stories? There is a central theme. I've actually heard, and I have not coached any of the people who have stood up here, but I've heard one phrase in particular that they repeated again and again and again. And so I have two questions for you. We're going to take about 5 to 8-ish minutes, and we're going to discuss this longer. So just right there, family, or row in front of you, behind you. We have these two questions on the screen for you, and I want you to take a few minutes and discuss that. The first question is, what do you learn about God's sovereignty from these stories? How is God moving people around for his glory in these stories? And number two is, what do you learn about why you live where you live based on these stories? All right, and go. Okay. This is not my final question for you. I have one more question. And you don't have to stop talking. You just have to come up here and talk. So I have this microphone. So our final question is, how are you going to live differently because of these stories? So this is kind of a responsive question for you. So if God has put something on your heart through the ESL testimony, through the testimony about Indonesia, through the testimony about Chad, or from the Joseph and Aquila, Priscilla, Paul, Apollos. Don't be shy. Come on, Clayton. I'll meet you part way. How about this? If you've got an idea, just come on and get in line with Clayton.
I volunteer blind Thomas. Where is he at? Or Sean. Okay. So the question I'm answering is this one: how are you going to live differently? I think for me, in our group, we were just talking about the ways of the Lord can have many different appearances. You know, any infinite number of appearances it can have. And just like Joseph, right? Like, faith would just say, regardless of geographically, literally where you are, you know, there's no place where God's favor can't be with you, right? And that doesn't always mean that God is going to protect you from suffering. That doesn't always mean that you're going to be physically delivered. But if you were thinking about the total call of the Lord, which is to just be used to God's will, a living sacrifice, then I just think it's by faith you will learn how to suffer well, right? You will learn how, if there is suffering, but ultimately
There will be.
right, there will be. There will be. But it's just to go back to Joseph's story, and I'll finish with this. His story had the appearance of brothers treating him unjustly. Thus, the natural mind would think, I've been treated unjustly. Maybe there's this puffed upness about yourself to where you feel like you're owed something, right? But we see that Joseph in the end was saying, no, no, no. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, right? So for us as Christians now, right, like we face attacks on all sides, Satan, the world, everyone who opposes the gospel. But if we take what Joseph said, and just kind of maximize that in everything, it's like, to us, it could appear like a lot of people mean evil for us, right?
Yeah.
But by faith, we would say, no, God means all this for good, right? And maybe if we take self out of it, right, and think about the total call to just be used by God, right, then it doesn't matter geographically where you are. It doesn't matter what happens to you physically, whatever. You have died, as what Colossians say, you have died, right? And your life is now hidden with Christ in God. So I'll say all that just to say, just the more we have faith, the less we try to fight things, and not to say that, everything that happens to you is just, right? But we know him who is just, right? In the midst of all those things, as long as we know God is sovereign and we're being used by God, then that's where our contentment should be and not comforts, if that makes sense. So, and that's what we talked about.
So suffer well. Thank you, Clayton.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm actually going to say what you just said, so I'm not copying, I promise. So a theme that really resonated with me and something that's going on in my life right now is to be faithful where we are. So myself and another attendee of Willcrest have had an amazing opportunity to take a missions class for the past 11 weeks. And it's called Perspectives. And it's really about what is God's perspective on missions and what is God's perspective of people and our role in that. And so I think through that class and then in today's sermon, to be faithful where we are planted. So God has just given me a new boldness over the past 11 weeks. Whether I'm at the grocery store or the gas station or just going about my daily life, to ask people how I can be praying for them. A lot of people know me here. You know that I'm friendly and that I don't know a stranger, but asking that question was very scary for me, and now it's not. And I have not had one person say to me, like, you crazy lady, you walk away. I don't want you to pray for me. I've had some amazing discussions. So I would really encourage everyone here today to be faithful where you are planted. And if you don't know what that looks like, ask God for wisdom. He will give it to you. And just like with El Harry, he will bring that person into your life. So be encouraged.
Thank you, Alex. Time for one more person. Make it good.
Good morning. My name is Alex too. The only difference is Alex Boy. So
That's right.
That's the only difference. So, like for me, just thinking about the question is like, so we like human beings, we are used to trust something we can see, we can touch, we can smell, right? That's like simple human being. I see it, I believe it, I touch it, it's true, and I smell it, tastes good. But in this case, so based on these two stories, like, I think things don't happen just for coincidence or happen just because it's going to happen. God always have a plan at the end of the day. And sometimes God's plan is going to be our plans. Sometimes God's plans is going to cause a little bit of suffering just to try to make us go the path he wants us to go. Because we have to be ready for it, right? It's better to be ready and then don't be ready when the opportunity is there. We're not ready to take it. So for me, just based on my story, I think God has a plan for every single of us. More day is just trusting in him. Trusting his plan is always going to be perfect. In the end of the day, I think the life we live is not just living for our own. You always have to live a life for serving others, but more than that is for glorify him. So I think for now, for me, it's just trusting more the plan he have in my life, and I think that's going to, regardless of like it or not, it's going to be the best for me.
Thank you, Alex. So the Mission Expo is not over, so we are not going to come to a time of invitation. Beth is going to lead us in one final song. What I do want to invite you to is we have a potluck lunch, which, speaking of seeing, smelling, and touching, I can smell it wafting in right now. And so we would love for you to join us. Following the lunch, I would say probably about 1:30, Lord willing, 1:30, we are going to come back in here and we have a video update from the Peru team. And so we have a lot of interesting footage and interviews about what God did on that trip.